Let's check out the story real quick. So this is from BuzzFeed. They say, Lil Baby's powerful Grammy performance that referenced George Floyd gave me chills. He deserves an award just for that performance. They say, my God, he just did the damn thing. Amazing. So he's like wearing this fake bulletproof vest, and they show this mock incident of Rayshard Brooks. Now, for those that don't remember, Rayshard Brooks was the guy who was driving drunk, and he was in the Wendy's drive-thru when he passed out drunk. Because he wouldn't move, someone called the cops, may have been the restaurant. When the police showed up, they were like, out of the vehicle, you've had too much to drink. When they tried to arrest him, he actually fought the cops, punched one of the cops in the face. There's multiple camera angles of the security footage, body cams, and then actually grabbed the taser and hit one of the cops with it, knocking him to the ground. The cop hit his head, got a concussion. When he ran for it, the other cop gave chase. Rayshard Brooks turned and then fired the second cartridge from the taser. And that's when the cop drew his weapon and shot the guy twice, and it killed him. We saw a lot of media propaganda. They put out this fake clip, this fake still from the incident where they tried claiming the cop kicked the guy when he was down, kicked Brooks when he's down. It didn't happen. But now what we're seeing at the Grammys, of all things, is they're doing this reenactment where in the reenactment, it's like the guy just peacefully gets on the ground and like puts his hands up. And it is not at all what you see in the actual body camera footage. For those that don't actually know the story, they would see this and they would believe the activist narrative as opposed to the actual truth. And this is one of the biggest problems we have right now, I think, in the country, is that a lot of people, they get their information secondhand. They get it distilled by people with political motives and agendas. And that's true of this show, and it's true of the Grammys. Granted, I think we're a bit more discerning and a bit more honest on this show. And there are many other political commentators who will be more honest, but for the most part, when it filters through people with agendas, you get lies and misrepresentations. But the bigger thing about this was that they brought out Tamika Mallory. The reason that's interesting is because she's been accused of pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. This was by the New York Times. And it made everybody really question the Women's March, of which she was one of the principal organizers. And I think there was a big controversy. Like some groups broke up, some pulled out. A bunch of activists were like, we don't want to be involved in this because she's got questionable associations. In this a speech or whatever, she said, we don't need allies, we need accomplices. And the crazy thing is when they're doing this depiction of riots as kind of a good thing, and they're having this activist come out and say these things, I think it's actually fairly worrying. So I guess the bigger question, though, is the political ramifications of this and whether or not we should actually even care about the Grammys, both because it's trash and the ratings are trash and no one cares about the Grammys, or more importantly, because should we get all hot and bothered by offensive performances, because we don't like it? So, Rucka, considering you do these videos, you clearly have no issue, what's the right word, being a troublemaker, I guess. I'm curious actually what you think about, this kind of stuff. I don't know if you've been following this, but I know you're a bit philosophical, right?
Yeah.
Well, so what's your thoughts on what's been going on this past year and like the Grammys, for instance?
I mean, it used to be like, 95% music and 5%, let's take this opportunity to remember that, like, killing unarmed civilians, and calling them gamer word with your arm, with your boot on their neck in their dying moments is not the way to progress forward as a nation. Now it's like 110% statements and like 1% music. And people are going to say, oh, that's way more percentage points than logic permits. So I'm going to pass it along to the smart looking guy here to explain that one.
Ian.
I think accomplice is a legal term for meaning that you're there for the crime. So, I mean, that's like a legal term. It's a weird word to use at the Grammys when you're talking about street violence.
Definitely.
Yeah.
When you're talking about people burning down a Wendy's that had nothing to do with anything. But I guess they were mad the Wendy's employees called the police because there was a drunk driver blocking their driveway. And so then decided to burn the Wendy's down. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make sense. But I think they've got premises that most people unfortunately have. So like, do you ever hear people saying like, we got to stop big tech, we got to stop letting big tech treat us this way. So they're taking all these separate companies, grouping them as though they're a monolith and wanting to basically either punish them or hamper them collectively. So why shouldn't all stores around the neighborhood get punished collectively if people are upset at the police? This is not a stretch. This is not a reach. I think I'm making a point. You're not going to hear anywhere but the Timcast podcast. Please go to timcast.org.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between a fast food restaurant that called the cops and big tech companies that actually have meetings together and are proven to actually collude with each other to remove political dissent. So, like, there's not a concerted effort among Wendy's, McDonald's, and Burger King to frame black individuals who fall asleep in their driveways. It was just some employee who was like, yo, there's some guy, like, sleeping in the driveway. Can you help us? And then when he fought the cops, he ended up losing his life, which is bad, by the way. I mean, cops should not be judge, jury, executioner. But this is a guy who grabbed a taser and turned and was trying to fire it at the cop. You can argue if the cop should not have used lethal force or whatever. That's something. But
look, you know as well as I do, people talk about Silicon Valley as if it's a monolith. So yeah, maybe Twitter, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube maybe met together, but at the same time, there's like a trillion other companies that are hoping to someday be at that level. They're doing plenty of work, and these companies are also trying to compete against one another. But they're lumped together mentally as though they're a monolith, and I'm just pointing that out. That's all.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
The term
See, it's a good point. We can move on.
Corporate media that gets thrown around. I don't trust the corporate media. Timcast is a corporation. It's a media corporation. I trust it. I work for it.
But like, yeah, I guess I agree. You know, we can absolutely do that. I think in terms of big tech, Silicon Valley, there's kind of like a theme people tend to be getting at. They control technology and infrastructure, and then with like Wendy's getting burnt to the ground. I don't know. Would you support, Google being burnt to the ground because activists were mad that there was hate speech on it?
Of course not. I don't support even demonizing Google or condemning these companies in the vast majority of cases, or in some cases, criticize them harshly. But obviously, I don't allow any level of violence by private citizens. We got a rule of law. Rule of law. I mean, and you see, and I hate to bring this up 5 minutes into the show, but when you look at the Capitol storming, you're seeing a bunch of reckless people treating everyone in that building as though they're part of this concerted effort to deprive them of their rights or something like that. I mean, we need to think critically and we need to be clear. So,
yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, so what are your thoughts on just like, I guess, the wokeification and the activistification of media and like, the Grammys, awards shows, commercial products? I'll put it this way. You're talking, it sounds like you're in defense of these corporations to a certain degree. Is that fair to say?
Depends what they're being accused of.
Sure. I'm saying, like, I see two big power monopolies, government and corporations. And I think left unchecked, power tends to corrupt absolutely. So I don't care if you're the government. I don't care if you're big oil or big tech or big Wendy's, or the Grammys pushing out a political message. I think it's a problem when too much power is concentrated in a specific area.
You don't think you're what someone could call big YouTuber?
I'm big. I'm a YouTuber.
You're a big YouTuber. Yeah. You have a lot more influence than a lot of people. So, like, you could always look at somebody much bigger and say, oh, no one should have that much power. But we know it's not power. Power is force. Power is pointing a gun at somebody. Okay, now we're getting demonetized. I meant well, no, actually,
that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, I talked about the killing of a dude by cops. So.
I think we need to differentiate economic power from political power. And the more we conflate the two, the more we conflate political and economic power, the more we're going to see economic power become the government. That is, corporations have friends in Washington, and we're going to see political power, basically politicians taking over the economy, taking over industry. So it's an ugly thing to watch. But it's been happening over 100 years. Over longer than 100 years. So, like, keep in mind, a lot of the outrageousness we see today is like the culmination of decades and decades and decades of these changes taking place. So there was always radicals talking about killing cops for many decades. We've had all types of shenanigans, people burning down the city when they're unsatisfied. This goes back probably to the days of like Irish people in the 19th century or whatnot. I don't mean to insult any Irish people. I love gingers. I love everybody who looks like that. I'm just saying,
there was like the what do you guys know what that thing was in Chicago where the anarchists, like, there was an explosion? What was that? I
don't know that much about it.
I used to know a lot more about this. I forgot. It's been a minute. But I think that's a fair point to mention too, is that like the extremism used to be substantially worse, I think, in not just this country, but many other countries, where you actually had, like, the Weather Underground was planting bombs and actually detonating them. Now we have widespread rioting over the past year, which arguably could be worse in that it's causing way more damage, disrupting way more people's lives. But I think, you go back 100 years, this is really bad. I mean, you've had treason, you've had sedition, you've had literal plots that involve high-powered weapons and warships. And it's kind of like fading a bit You know, and the conflicts we're getting into now are mostly people protesting and pushing each other and shoving. Some people get arrested and they scream police brutality, and then they do burn down buildings and stuff. So my fear is whether or not this escalates into more serious violence. That's what I don't want to happen.
There's no question that crime has gone down overall over the last few decades. I don't think there's any question of that. So, like, overall, we've gotten more civilized, but, like, what we've seen, not just in 2020, but, I mean, there's been plenty of rioting and looting and all types of outrageous stuff happening, for some time. But, like, 2020 was the year of no more F's to give, right?
Yeah.
And I don't feel like this country is my home anymore. That's kind of the feeling I got in the summer of 2020. That's how I felt on January 6th. And I know someone's going to comment, oh, that's 2021. How about I come over there and we settle this? Get all of your little DVD collecting Proud Boys, and I'll get all my BLM people, and we'll settle this. All of you internet commenters, I'm gonna find every last one of you.
What do you mean summer of 2020? You're talking about
the rioting, the
BLM
violence,
riots.
burning down Wendy's and private businesses and the police stations. I mean, it's absolutely disheartening to say the least. And I was wondering, is it gonna seep into residential areas? Like what?
It did.
What's, okay, but I mean, is it gonna basically just be home after home getting broken into, and that's it? Goodbye to any semblance of civilization.
I just had a horrific portent about the Chinese military invading and swiftly taking over the United States like a blitzkrieg. Like if we were stupid enough to let our guard. Like they were running war games and they're like, no, we can't stop the Chinese if they attacked us.
No, we talked about this with James Lindsay. Are you familiar with James?
Maybe
he's like a very he's the preeminent scholar on critical race theory in terms of criticizing it and what it's doing and this like wokeness and things like that. And what he was mentioning when it comes to China is that they're using political warfare. So it seems more like they're interfering in our culture. They're interfering in our advertisements, our cultural creations, our TV shows, our radio programs, our schools, and things like that. So you end up with ultra woke Grammys asking for people to basically commit crimes. This is the thing. This performance they did, and the reason I think it's important to bring up is that it's not that they're directly saying, hey, go commit crimes. They're showing riots, viewing those riots as the good guys. Like they're depicting that as they're the good guys, the cops the bad guys, the people burning down the buildings are the Black Lives Matter activists who are fighting, who are the good guys. Then they say we need accomplices. They're advocating for tearing ourselves apart. This is people in the United States pointing the finger at the United States and saying, burn it down. Burn it all down. That's a direct quote from a lot of these activists. They've jumped up on cars and they've yelled, burn it all down. Do you think people in China do that? They don't. Now, first and foremost, they're not legally allowed to. And that's kind of scary. That you've got these two views. In the U.S., you're allowed to, so we actually just fight ourselves and scream at each other. And then in China, they're forced to, this authoritarian system keeps them in line. And they're growing rapidly. They're expanding. They're engaging in political warfare with us, and then we're on the verge of falling apart. I mean, that was a bold statement you just made.
Which statement was that?
You didn't feel like this was your country anymore.
I mean, it was a true statement. It was an emotional tell. I mean, like seeing, Melrose Avenue, Beverly Hills, seeing beautiful things destroyed, and not only destroyed, but being like apologized for. That meaning like people downplaying the severity of it and people encouraging it. I don't feel like LA is a city where I could meet somebody in the street and feel a bond with them. Now, obviously, a lot of people were not happy with what took place, to put it lightly. But I mean, the fact that culturally people are comfortable encouraging such behavior says that morally, in the way people think about ethics, the people committing that type of violence have the moral high ground. That's why they're comfortable getting on the Grammys and saying we need accomplices. So, I mean, the question to ask is not so much what's wrong with critical race theory, but what's the alternative? What are you offering as an alternative?
Classical liberalism.
Interesting statement.
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean to you?
Classical liberalism is typically about protecting the rights of the individual. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, that's the strongest way to put it. So, I don't know. Is there any more specific?
Well, I mean, I think...
Versus, like, what we're saying with critical race theory is race-based collectivism. So we can get into...
Yeah, I mean, I like where you're going with this, but is there a period of time in American history, for instance, you would say that's like when the classical liberals hung out?
What do you mean?
Like, would you say the Founding Fathers? Would you say the 1940s? Like, is there a period of time?
No. there's some elements of classical liberalism that have existed in the United States at various periods, but it's never been like.
Has it ever been more than less? Is there like a?
I don't think the U.S. has ever been mostly classically liberal or libertarian in that regard.
Interesting.
If you go back to the founding fathers, for instance, slavery, like there's no question. People were kept as property. And more importantly, while the ideas of classical liberalism helped drive the idea that we no longer had to be under the knee of some, divine prominence, the king declaring it, we certainly didn't have absolute freedoms. There was cultural enforcement of various ideas, women not being able to do certain things, but we've progressed greatly. My issue now is that we got to this period where it was like, it was almost going to get pretty good. In the 90s, we still had censorship. But we had that air. We had people like George Carlin, and we had, he was willing to be offensive and say things that really ruffled feathers. We do have people like that today still. Now we're starting to get hard pushback from more moral authoritarians again. And so my thing is like, we don't want critical race theory. We don't want race-based collectivism. That to me is nightmarish, right? There's this guy who just went viral earlier today because he tweeted to Bill Burr, who's got a black wife, that it may be a sign of racism, and he referred to Bill Burr's wife. And he's claiming he didn't, but he did, as a minority adult use slave. We'll put it that way.
Like Sally Hemings?
He literally claimed like Bill Burr was keeping this woman around for his pleasure as a slave. And it was one of the most shockingly disgusting things I've heard from a critical race theorist. So I'm like, hey, let's respect the individual. Let's live and let live. Let's have some we need some regulation and some restriction, but we mostly want individual freedom. There's an interesting debate in the idea of collectivism in that there does have to be some, not none, but that we're going in the wrong direction with it. Does that answer your question? Did I do a good job?
I mean, you gave me your point of view. So I think the topic of slavery and women's suffrage complicates things in a way that's difficult for me to make the point that I'm trying to make. But obviously, in most of history, slavery and ownership of women, basically pushing, telling women what to do, has been the norm. I think your co-host looks like he still supports those things.
Why are you ragging on Ian so much, man?
You got to have that guy.
It's like a grounding rod.
Yeah.
Ian's the opposite of those things. He's like the leftiest guy on the show.
He's so nice.
I can't say
saying.
too much now. I'm gonna get a little extreme.
Now, but like so I think in their time, the Enlightenment thinkers, the Age of Reason, as Thomas Paine, I think, dubbed it, people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and, people laugh at you now, especially people on the right. They mock you for saying this. But in their context, in their time in history, even though slavery was a norm, even though women were still largely seen as basically trading cards, in their context, they were taking a very bold new step. For man in drafting the Declaration of Independence, saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they were going to have property. Did you know this? They were going to have property, life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. And I wish they had it in there in order to help us have a lot more capitalism for a lot longer, possibly. But do you know why they didn't have property in there? Because they wanted to stick it to the slaveholders, because they knew they would use their so-called property, their slaves, as an extra vote or something like that.
Right.
All right. But so when you look at context, when you see when you look at the history of philosophy and all of the great brave steps that it took to go from the just blurry and reckless ancient and prehistoric, even before that, prehistoric times, to get to a point where you have intellectuals establishing a country, being willing to fight for it, but then once the war is won, to sit and debate painstakingly and to ask what is human nature? What is the best type of society for a human being to live and to pursue life, liberty, and his own happiness? To get to that point is a magnificent intellectual achievement that we take for granted. So when I say classical liberal, I'm talking about those guys. I'm talking about the Age of Reason. And I'm not talking about what came after them, especially in America, like intellectuals pragmatists, utilitarians, progressives, obviously. And of course, we get the postmoderns, and we get the the critical race theorists, which is probably an offshoot of postmodern or something. I'm not an expert like your previous guest. Go.
I agree with you on the founding fathers. A lot of people don't realize this, but it wasn't just a political revolution; it was an ideological revolution. Mm-hmm. A lot of countries on the world were under the crown or some monarch or some autocrat or some kind of system where it was, these kings would say by divine providence, I am the king, God wills it, and then they would just tell people do it or else. And they had people who are loyal to that idea and to them. And then all of a sudden you get this group of people in the U.S. Some of them, I've read a little bit about this. The authority of the founding fathers was questioned even by some, like based on how they were voted to represent the colony they came from, because it was like, who saith this colony that you represent them and want independence? But these are a lot of people who are like, yo, we don't need a king. We can rule by the consent of the governed. We can create something new. It's truly profound. And there were a lot of ideas, but I think when you look back at history, while I absolutely take the good from the founding fathers, I've got the coin collection for Thomas Jefferson. I love it. I think the dude was a genius. I also think he was a product of his times. And there's a lot of things back then we criticize. The reason I don't highlight all of those and emphasize them and condemn the founding fathers over those things is that we've changed, and we don't want to be like, we hate these people because they did bad things. No, we want to say they did bad things, but here are these really, really good things we're keeping now. But I do think it's fair to point out.
I mean, they did a lot of bad things, but that we're not here to talk about them as people. We're talking about the ideas that they promoted and the effect that what made them stand out in history.
And so, while I agree with you about the founding fathers, for their time was a radical bunch of classical liberal types fighting for the rights of the individual against this king, willing to literally fight and die. And many of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence had their legacies, their names, and their lives stripped away from them. That was a bold and amazing bunch of people. Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.